All right, we're back, and apparently I'm in the wrong spot. I apologize. Okay, I've had students look at my lectures and say, you could have edited that out. And that's true. I could, if I knew how. I could have stopped it, and I could have started the recording again. There are a lot of things I could do, but I want to get this done. And let's be honest, if we were in class, you would have a moment while I was loading up my PowerPoint. So welcome to my version of a real class. So please, I apologize, and don't tell me I could be editing this. I could have edited that whole diatribe out if I wanted to, but I did not do that. Okay. So we're back, and we're going to be talking about the history of psychology. Sorry, I keep forgetting to put the I-O on the beginning of that. The history of I-O psychology, which is kind of an accident that I said that, but also kind of it makes sense that I accidentally called I-O psychology. Because one of the things that's really interesting about industrial and organizational psychology is that the industrial psychology side emerged almost concurrently with the development of psychology in general. It was really important to psychologists at the very beginning of the field to be useful. And so from the very beginning, psychologists were interested in giving back, doing psychology in the public interest, they called it. And so there was educational psychology very early on, right? An applied topic that, would hopefully help the children's youth to become educated, right? So I-O psychology, how can we improve work? How can we improve workers? How can we get the most money for the employer? Those kinds of questions were very early questions for psychologists. So prior to World War I, Walter Dill Scott, in 1901, in fact, that's well before World War I, which started in 1914. So in 1901, Walter Dill Scott gave a talk on the psychology of advertising, possibly to the detriment of consumers for at least 100 years, because he talked about how we could apply what we know about consumer thinking and understandings and things to advertising. So we could, for example, knowing that people want narrow waists, for example, we could emphasize our product having an impact on that, right? He really made this argument that advertising really is psychology. And I think we can all agree advertising is really a work or business endeavor, right? So in 1903, he published a book on the theory of advertising. And then the last thing I wanted to mention about Walter Dill Scott is that he was the first professor of applied psychology at Carnegie Tech. So you'll notice it wasn't called I-O psychology or I-psychology or advertising psychology. It was just called applied. And it's really important for you guys to know the difference between applied psychology and basic psychology. Applied psychology is when you are doing your research or your theoretical development with a specific goal in mind. You have a reason why you're trying to figure this out because you want to solve some kind of current problem. As opposed to basic psychology where we're testing theories, we're testing hypotheses, we're trying to maybe provide evidence that would support or refute an existing theory, things like that. We aren't necessarily going to do anything with those findings other than publish them and let other people know, right? With applied psychology, we're trying to, find a solution to a current problem. Now, Hugo Munsterberg published a book called Psychology and Industrial Efficiency in 1913. Okay, so notice that word industrial, right? So he was working on the question of how to get the greatest productivity out of employees. And he was trying to use psychology to motivate employees, to inform businesses about how to select employees or reimburse employees, or, like these basic psychological factors that would help to improve industrial efficiency. So 1913. So these are very early ideas on advertising and on efficiency that were being developed. It was actually the case that Europe was developing I-O psychology earlier and faster than the U.S. was. In fact, Munsterberg was in Europe. Europeans were much more interested in efficiency. In the U.S., we were still very agrarian compared to Europe. And so Europe was really trying to get efficiency and trying to really get good employees and things like that. Now, World War I through the 1920s. So this is, 1914 through the 1920s. I don't know if we entered the war immediately at 1914, but, roughly the World War I era through the 1920s. So there was a big boost in military personnel work during this period. The military was really trying to figure out how to recruit good employees, how to develop a leadership structure that would work well, things like that. Robert Yerkes developed the Army Alpha and Beta mental ability tests during this period of time, and he was trying to come up with questions that would allow us to determine which, I don't know, I called soldiers or recruits employees a second ago. I guess they technically are because they get paid. But during World War I, they had selective service where you had to register and you didn't necessarily volunteer, right? You got sent. So we have this group of people who are coming in, and he was trying to help the military figure out how to place these recruits into the appropriate job for their capacities. So that was the function of his mental ability tests. These tests that he developed, if you've studied tests and measurements, you're familiar with how quickly we went from having ideas about measuring people's mental abilities to having like a variety of tests for assessing people's mental abilities. So the Army Alpha and Beta mental ability tests were early in the U.S. Tests of mental ability, but then those tests started to expand into government beyond the military. They started to expand in use into the private industry, and they took on different forms. There are different kinds of tests that were developed off of Yerkes tests. Bruce V. Moore got the first ever PhD in O Psychology, and you'll notice it's at Carnegie Tech. So remember in the last slide I was talking about the first applied psychology lab was at Carnegie Tech. Well, one of the applications of psychology is, IO, or actually back then they would have just called it industrial psychology. He developed the strong vocational interest blank for men. Very interesting time. So the strong vocational interest blank, strong is actually one of the authors, it's not like strong as in powerful, it's strong as in somebody's name. And it was a vocational test to determine what aptitudes a man, because women don't need to be taking this, obviously, in 1921. So it was for men to figure out what their vocational aptitudes were, what their interests really were. He was the first president of Division 14 of APA, which has now become PSYOP. Frederick Taylor, during this period of time, developed the idea of scientific management styles and gave a lot of lectures and wrote about that idea of using scientific basis for management styles, using science to govern management. And then here's, look, a woman. You guys have all been told that there are no women in, the history of psychology. Lillian Gilbreth was actually a really interesting case because she was an IO psychologist. She wrote The Psychology of Management. She's also the mother of 10 children. In fact, if you've ever seen the movie Cheaper by the Dozen, it was based on her book called Cheaper by the Dozen. And, the escapades of having, 12 people in her family, 10 of them children. She also invented the waste paper basket or garbage can that you might be familiar with, where you step on the little step and it causes the lid to go up. She invented and patented that. So she was quite the creative in lots of ways, right? Created a bunch of kids, created a trash can and some other things that were important for home economics, and then also wrote the book, The Psychology of Management. All right. Now, through the Depression, up to World War II. Not World War II hasn't broken out yet at the end of this slide. It'll just be up to that point. So we're looking at 1930s to about 1940. Of course, this was the Great Depression. So during this period, employers were really, really interested in maximizing efficiency so that because the highest cost in just about any industry is salaries. So if they can get the most they can out of an employee, then there's a chance that they might, break even or make a profit. So during this period, the Hawthorne studies were conducted. And you guys might have heard about this in your general psychology class or maybe in another class. The Hawthorne studies were conducted in Hawthorne, Illinois at the Western Electric plant. And what they were trying to figure out is how to improve productivity on a light bulb production line. And the researchers came out, the IO researchers came out, and they said things like, well, I see that you have some burned out lights here in the work area. If you change out those light bulbs, productivity will go up because your employees can see better. So they replaced the light bulbs and productivity went up, and the researchers were like, see, we are so smart. Man, and that was easy. That was just, you guys make light bulbs. How much could that have cost? But then the plant calls them back and says, our productivity is back down to what it was before you came here. So the researchers go back out and they say, well, it's pretty drab in here. You should paint your walls bright yellow to really, energize your employees and their productivity will go up. So the plant painted the walls and productivity went up, and the researchers said, man, we are good. And then they get a call. Productivity's gone back down to what it had been before you got here. So now they became curious. The researchers are like, every time we go out there, we make a change. Productivity does go up, but then it goes down. What is going on here, right? So now they just start changing things. Let's take out some light bulbs. Let's put, productivity, by the way, went up after they took out some light bulbs. Let's put little streamers hanging down from the fan so that the employees will see that the air is circulating, and they'll feel cooler, psychologically, and so then they'll be more productive. And that did work until it didn't work anymore. And they kept trying everything, one after another, and they realized every change they made caused an increase in productivity, and then it went back to normal. And so what they ultimately concluded is, it's not about what changes we're making, it's that we're making changes. The employees are realizing that we're paying attention to them, that we're interested in their productivity, and that's what's changing their behavior. As soon as we stop looking at them, it goes back to normal. So the Hawthorne studies really illuminated something called demand effects in psychology and in research, that oftentimes, the person that you're observing in an experiment or in an observational study or any kind of situation, being observed can actually change their behavior. So it may not be that your treatment was the key. It might just be that you're trying something. So that's something that sticks with us today. So something very early on that was motivated by trying to improve productivity has had a big impact on psychology. Going on through the Depression, there was a focus on social and psychological conditions of work. During this period of time, we had the potential to really exploit employees, right? Because there were a lot of people out of work who were maybe willing to work for less than they should be willing to work, or for longer hours than they should be willing to do, or whatever, because they were afraid to lose their job because they needed it. So during this period of time, IO psychologists got really interested in team development and supervision and group processes and motivating employees and other things that would help to ultimately improve the work life of employees during this period of time. A lot of this research was sponsored by the government. During the Great Depression, there were programs that were designed to get people back to work, called like the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the WPA, the Work Progress Administration. There were all sorts of programs designed to try and get people back to work and to have satisfying work lives. So kind of ironically, during this time when there was a lot of competition for jobs and not that much money running around, this was an opportunity for IO psychology to really shine and show what it was good at. Okay, then the World War II comes along, right? And up to about the mid-1960s, we're going to see that the military, again, is really driving the research in IO psychology. The research centers emerged that were funded by the military. So we had the Army Research Institute that we still have, the Air Force Human Resources Lab, which we still have. The O side, the focus on organizational dynamics, on work groups, on morale, emerged as being just as important as the I side, which, as you recall, is interested in selection and training and assessing and stuff. So getting interested in what is going on within the organization became just as important to IO psychology. There was a mushrooming of IO training programs. There had been just that Carnegie program, and then now we have the University of Maryland, Michigan State came online, George Washington University, and then there is the Research Center for Group Dynamics that was developed at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So we started to have more options for training. It's still today the case that there aren't that many places to get trained in IO psychology for graduate students, but it really has been growing. I'm looking for the word, sorry, because I wouldn't say, exponentially or something, but it's been growing steadily. It kind of grows and then kind of pulls back a little bit depending on what's going on. So when there's a lot of investment, the programs tend to grow. Now, if you look at this list of IO training programs that emerged in this period between World War II and the mid-1960s, these are still programs that are predominant, like really eminent programs. If you were interested in this area and you got into one of these graduate programs, that would be a huge status symbol, because these are considered, these that are on this slide and then Carnegie Mellon are considered the top. I am very proud to tell you I have an undergraduate who got into Carnegie Mellon. So we're very excited about that. Those are preeminent training programs in this field. From the mid-1960s to the mid-1980s, we're going to see that there's not a lot of military need for IO psychologists, and so what we're going to see is that the field is growing and trying to figure out what niche it really fills. So in 1970, Division 14 of the APA became Industrial and Organizational Psychology. Membership increased from 756 members in 1960 to over 2,000 by 1980. So during this period of time, there was a lot of growth in, at least in psychology majors, wanting to go into this field. The civil rights movement was really an important factor for the growth of IO psychology, because what we were starting to be used for as IO psychologists was developing selection materials that would be unbiased, right? Developing performance appraisal methods that would be unbiased. So trying to take out that possibility that the person is hiring an applicant because of some demographic quality, or taking out the idea that a person gets promoted because of some demographic quality. Now, it kind of comes and goes in different ways, but basically this civil rights movement really pushed towards the development of selection tools and performance appraisal tools that would help take out the individual from the, take out the individual who's doing the appraisal or selection decisions, take their sort of biases out of the decision. A lot of emphasis on developing fair testing. You guys might have heard that, for example, intelligence tests are not racially fair. And if you've taken tests and measurements, hopefully you've learned that that phrase is not accurate and we shouldn't be using it. But I'm not teaching tests and measurements right now, so I won't go into the whole thing. But the goal is to develop tests that if a person has the quality that you're looking for, that will emerge on that test, right? That's the goal, is to come up with tests that don't come in with some kind of bias that make it impossible for a person with the quality to actually show that they have that quality, because other irrelevant factors are being, are obscuring that quality. So it seems really simple and it's really hard. So this period of time 1960s to 1980s was a period of time when IO psychologists really got interested in developing these things, and they worked really hard on them. But we're still working on ways to eliminate individual bias from selection and promotion and performance appraisal. Some hot topics during this period: job characteristics. A lot of times during this period, if you were looking for a job, you would look in the want ads of the newspaper. For those of you who are young enough, you're like, what? And want ads charged by the character. So you would get like, it was like Twitter. You'd get 200 characters for one fee. And then if you wanted to go over that amount, then you had to pay like double just for a little bit over that amount. And so people who were recruiting employees would try and be as brief as they could to try and, lure people to come and apply, when then they could maybe reveal more about what the job was once they got there. So you can imagine a lot of people got their time wasted by going down and applying for jobs that they really weren't interested in or qualified for, based on these little tiny blurbs that were in the newspaper. So it became really important that if you're going to be having these kinds of blurbs that are luring people down, that you need to have some kind of way of communicating with them what the actual job characteristics are, like what is actually required of this job. So hot topics during this period of time was to try and figure out, what does a job entail? Like if I'm hiring for a secretary, what are the characteristics of secretary? I use that term on purpose because that was a term that was very common in the 1960s and 1980s. We don't really talk about secretaries too much anymore, but you're an administrative assistant or something else today. But back then, if I'm hiring for a secretary, what does that mean? What are the characteristics of this job? Hot topics, you're going to see this carryover from the last period that we just talked about, which was the World War II period, right? Motivation, employee motivation. And this is going to continue to be a hot topic for us in modern times. Like, how do we keep an employee motivated towards their, production, efficiency, or whatever we're trying to keep them motivated towards? How do we keep a positive attitude among our employees? How do we keep their attitude being, pro our organization? How do we get them to feel proud that they work for this organization? Things like that. So hot topics. Now, mid-1980s to about today, seems like a really long time span compared to the other more brief time spans that we had talked about before, but 1980s to roughly today, IO psychology has been rapidly growing. PSYOP membership, which is what we now call Division 14 of APA, has about 3,900 professionals and about 3,000 students. So, we had about 2,000 at 1980, and now, we're looking at about 7,000 today. So really a lot of growth in just membership in the group. There are about 70 doctoral programs, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little less, depending on what's going on. You might be wondering, how do you have more or less sort of on the whim? But sometimes, a person retires and they were the crux of this training program and we weren't able to replace them. And so, what, we're going to pull back, we only do a master's now or something like that. So things come, things go. But so it's around 70 doctoral programs. There are more master's degree programs out there than there are doctoral programs for sure. There are about 1,000 people who call themselves an IO psychology professor around the globe. I can't really call myself an IO psychology professor because my major is cognition. You're going to notice as we go through this book, it makes a lot of sense that a person who's interested in cognition is interested in IO psychology. It's not a huge leap, but I can't call myself an IO psychology professor because I don't have that credential. Mine's a cognitive credential. So when you talk about a person who's an IO psychology professor, you're talking about a person who has the full IO training through their PhD that makes them eligible to call themselves that. So that's why, there's probably more of us out there who teach these things. And my training went through my master's degree, but my PhD was in cognition. So what issues are going to be affecting IO psychology in the 21st century? Of course, it's really hard to predict what's going on and what's going to go on, right? I mean, I don't think in the 1980s they were going to predict that there was going to be an internet, right? Or that people would have cell phones that we could walk around and we could actually answer emails with and things. So, I mean, it's really hard to predict what issues may be really super important going forward. But these are the things that we're focusing on. One is just a given, global competition. We have trade with every country in the world practically. Every country sort of tries to build up their own versions of things, and now we have to compete with that. So we have to have good skills training so that our employees can compete on a global scale. A lot of times we have multinational companies. I mean, it's really hard to think of a company that doesn't have, like a big company that doesn't have branches in other countries. So it's really super important to have our employees trained up so that they know how to interact with members of other cultures when there's meetings or there's, convention type of, we all got together or those kinds of things. So we're not offending each other within our own company. So we have to bridge those cultures, and IO psychologists can really help with that. One of the big things that's going on is downsizing. It started with the 2008 recession that took a really long time to start to repair itself. And so companies right away, of course, started, trying to downsize in the form of, like I said, the most expensive thing is salaries. So they lay off workers. They're trying to stay afloat. Even 10 years later, a lot of employers never have gotten back to the level of employment that they had had before the recession. They're like, you know what, we've been running pretty lean. It's been working pretty well. So now we have employees who are what we call survivors of big layoffs, who their job has expanded out from underneath them. They're like, I had this one set of rules or roles or expectations for me, and now that we've fired a bunch of people, I have additional rules and additional roles and additional jobs that I have to be doing. And so helping those survivors to handle the increase in workload or the expansion of their responsibilities is really important. And going forward, it's going to be really important for IO psychologists to develop strategies for, keeping employees motivated even in the face of extra work or more diverse work. Ethics. More and more it seems like there are no knowns as far as what's an ethical behavior and what's an unethical behavior in the world. Like we say, well, in some cultures they do this, in some cultures they do that. So now we're left with, well, we don't want to be disrespectful of somebody else's culture. So we might make a bad decision as a result of not just sort of having an ethical guideline for us as an organization. One of the things that IO psychologists can do is really recognize the antecedents, the things that came prior to making a bad decision, right? Like what path is this company going down and what could we foresee is going to happen as a result of going down this path, right? So what we're really doing is trying to use IO psychologists to help prevent problems in organizations that might be, way down the road that the organization's like, but we're making good money and our employees seem happy. And so, we're just going to keep doing this. And the IO psychologist might say, okay, this is what is likely to happen in the long run if you continue down this path. So looking at those antecedents that could predict a downfall. Diversity is a big issue in companies and organizations today. We have, for one thing, remember back when we talked about, the period from 1901 to the start of World War I, they had that strong vocational inventory for men, right? For one thing, the diversity is that we have, people of both sexes in the workplace these days. We have all genders represented in the workplace these days, and then we have, age differences. We have people who are, brand new employees working with people who have been there 40 years. Like I mentioned, my colleague who, he's been at Eastern Washington for 40 years. We have a brand fresh new faculty member who graduated from her PhD in 2016, right? So these working together, right? We have to be able to respect each other's differences based on age differences. We have to be able to respect each other's differences based on religion or race or ethnicity or all the different things that make all of us unique and different and contributing to our, climate of our organization. So things that we can do is, coordinate the different groups. Some employers think that the best way to gain respect for each other's differences is to be put together in work groups and work side by side. There's a lot of research that supports that idea. back in the 60s, they did a study of Boy Scouts, and they mixed groups based on demographics. They mixed them together and had them work on a task. And when they worked on a task, they came out with much more positive attitudes about the members of the other groups than they had coming into working on the group project. So, mixing people together, coordinating people together, educating for sensitivity and differences, right? Some of us are more sensitive to differences than others. Some of us deny our awareness of differences. We go, oh, I don't notice that, or that's not a problem for me, or I have lots of friends like that, or other things that are actually very insensitive. So educating people about each other's way of viewing the world and things like that can really help to stave off a lot of disagreements or hurt feelings or other things that could really undermine the morale of the company. Technology. I am recording this lecture in the middle of the global pandemic, and we're all working from home. So anybody who's listening to this someday in the future on YouTube, hopefully this is just a dim memory in your mind. But this is, spring of 2020, and one of the big things that we're all doing is working through technology. I'm recording this lecture because what was supposed to have been a face-to-face class has now moved into a virtual class. Having virtual teams, being able to meet via Zoom and talk about something rather than sending emails back and forth, we've discovered is a really big benefit. A lot of times when we are sending emails back and forth, we don't fully read what the other person wrote. We don't say what we mean to say very well because, writing's hard, and we can have misunderstandings and things like that. So the fact that technology is going to be a big part of the future is an opportunity for IO psychologists to really insert what we know psychologically about people and help corporations or organizations to really benefit from. If I'm going to have a virtual team and we're never going to be in the same room, psychology will tell you, we need to have periodic meetings via some kind of at least what feels like face-to-face if we can't have actual face-to-face, right? Another issue with technology is the issue of telecommuting. The fact that we can do it does not necessarily mean that we should do it, and that's something that IO psychologists can really help organizations sort out. During this global pandemic, those of us who are faculty, we're sort of left to our own devices to figure out how to deliver our content in a way that we feel like will be appropriate to our students and to devote our time in a way that makes sense to do that, right? People who are what we call certified staff, that's not the right, classified staff who are employees who work in the office and those kinds of things, they're being handled a lot differently. They're being told, for example, you're still supposed to work the number of hours that you normally work in the office. You're still supposed to respect the break times that you had when you were in the office, things like that. Now, in face-to-face life, I'm not held to break times or other things also. So I guess it's kind of parody to say that a person who normally has to take a certain number of breaks and stuff like that still has to do it at home. But imagine, how do you implement? Why would you implement, is my question, this argument that you're only supposed to take 2 breaks and a lunch in the middle of the day, even though you're working from home? As a person who works from home a lot, I work more than I would if I went in, clocked in at 8 and clocked out at 5. I work way more hours. And so it seems like I felt like in the email that I saw that was directed at classified staff, the impression I got was that they were trying to make sure that the classified staff was still putting in the number of hours that they should be putting in. Maybe they were taking it from the other angle where they were worried that the classified staff might overwork, which I think is the bigger risk, that the classified staff member may end up not shutting their computer at 5 and stopping work, because that's what I know I do. Telecommuting brings up a lot of issues, like what kind of control does the employer have over the employee? Should they try to assert that kind of control? Is it to the benefit of the motivation of the employee, right? There's a lot of things to consider. There's a discussion going on because of this virtual teaching all of a sudden among faculty about whether we should have lockdown browser on our exams. Now, I teach online all the time. I don't teach this class online typically, but I teach a lot of classes online, and I don't use lockdown browser. And so I'm against it, but I haven't said anything in the conversations. But what's been interesting about the conversation is if you don't do lockdown browser, how do you know that they're not cheating? And that's kind of that telecommuting question that a lot of times organizations have about their employees. How do I know that they're working if I can't see them? And I feel like, and some of my colleagues agree with this, that you can tell whether they did the work by what they put out, right? By the output. So there are different perspectives on this, and it's something that needs to sort of be sorted out. Like, what kinds of policies can a company put into place to ensure that technology is benefiting the company and not undermining the company? I guess is the basic issue. Another big thing that's going on in modern companies is a flatter organizational structure. It used to be the case that you'd have like one person at the top called the CEO, and under the CEO would be, the vice presidents, and then under the vice presidents were the managers and like that. Today, major corporations have much flatter organizational structure. For example, they may have all at the equal level. They might have the CEO, CFO, COO, all those guys being at the same, all those people being at the same level in the organization, and there might be a lot of them. And then underneath them, there might be a lot of managers. And then underneath them, there's, sort of an equal number of employees that they sort of manage. The organizational structure is not as triangle shaped. I was going to say pyramid, but probably more triangle shaped. Today, it's much more rectangular shaped. So that's why I kind of made it this big flat rectangle to illustrate that there might be lots of people at each level of the organization, and they are all equivalent to each other as far as authority, empowerment. So people might be expected to have more self-management than they expected to have. A lot of times in a leaner organization where we have fewer of the, fat cats at the top or something, you have a leaner organization where more is expected out of every individual. And you might be asked to make decisions that as a person, in your perspective, you might be like, why are you asking me, right? I'm not in charge of that. Well, in a flatter organizational structure, a lot of times they'll poll everybody and they want to know everybody's opinion. And it can be empowering. It can be disconcerting. So these are things that IO psychologists can really help with. I'll just give you a minimum, really super small example. If we're going to have, let's say, a meeting in one of these flatter organizations, and we really want to know what our employees or our associates think about an issue, we should give them fair warning ahead of time that this is what we're going to talk about, and we're going to be asking your opinion, so they can come to the meeting ready for it. This is something that we know from psychology. A lot of times we come into a meeting, we find out that we're supposed to decide something right now on the fly. We haven't had time to really think about it. We didn't know we'd be asked this question, and so no one says anything, and the person who's running the meeting comes to the conclusion that everybody agrees that, okay, let's go. This is what we call groupthink, right? And so sometimes with flatter organizational structure, we end up with actually more power in the hands of the leader because the other people aren't going to say anything. So it's a trick. And so IO psychology can really help organizations to work in this context. Okay, so that takes us through where we are right now, what we think the big issues will be. We will resume in the next lecture with Chapter 2.